They said the Rajput queens chose fire over shame. That the flames of Johor were their final defiance, an act of faith and fury against conquest. But history forgets those who did not burn. The queens who were captured alive, whose voices were erased beneath silk veils and gold chains. This is their story, the untold side of victory, where silence screamed louder than swords. If stories of power, betrayal, and forgotten courage speak to you, subscribe, stay, and listen closely. Because this one isn't about kings or conquerors. It's about the women who outlived them. The air was thick with dust and prayers. Cannons thundered against the walls of Chitta, and the sky turned the color of blooded brass. I remember standing at the highest balcony of the fort, watching the smoke rise like a god we no longer trusted. My husband, Rana Devroj, was already at the ramparts. I had begged him not to fight, not because I feared death, but because I feared what would come after. They said the Mughals offered mercy. But we had seen their mercy, it came with chains and sermons and the slow erasure of names. Inside the zenana, the women prepared for Johor. The priest recited verses, the younger wives trembled. I should have joined them. I almost did. But something in me, some desperate, unholy instinct, made me stay my hand. I told myself I wanted to live, to bear witness. But the truth is crueler, I was afraid. When the gates finally broke, the earth shook. The Mughal soldiers poured in like a black tide, swallowing everything. I remember the cries, the clang of metal, the sudden silence after the first wave of slaughter. I hid behind the temple pillars, clutching the goddess's feet, my palms slick with blood and ash. They found me at dawn. A soldier with eyes like winter pointed his sword at me, then hesitated. Perhaps he saw something pitiful in my face, or perhaps he saw property. Either way, I was spared. They took me to the camp outside the fort. The air reeked of burnt stone and flesh. I looked back at the fort, my home, now a grave. The smoke spiraled upward, and I thought of the women who had burned, their screams turning into wind. I wondered if their souls envied mine or pitied it. That night, I sat in the Mughal general's tent. He called me gift. Said the emperor would decide my fate. His voice was smooth, practiced, and empty. I asked him if he believed in heaven. He laughed. For men like us, Begum, he said, heaven is conquest. As he spoke, I felt something inside me fracture, not like glass, but like ice. Quietly, inevitably. And though I did not yet know it, that fracture would become the only part of me the Mughals would never own. They brought the queens to Agra at dusk, veiled, silent, surrounded by guards whose eyes avoided theirs. The sound of anklets against the marble echoed like faint bells at a funeral. The war had ended a week earlier. The forts had fallen. What remained of Rajput pride now moved under the weight of Mughal chains. Among them was Rani Devyani of Muir, her name that once meant defiance and light. She had refused to leave her fort even as flames consumed it. Yet fate, ever cruel, had chosen to keep her alive. The harem keepers, old women hardened by decades of royal servitude, stripped them of their silks and jewels. Every bangle, every earring, relics of another life, vanished into the imperial treasury. They were given new garments, fine muslin, scented with attar, but it smelled foreign, unholy. "You are among queens now," said the chief eunuch, his voice rehearsed. "The emperor spares those he admires." His words meant safety. But they carried another meaning too, ownership. Devyani said nothing. She had heard stories of those admired by emperors. Some lived in luxury. Others disappeared into the silence of marble walls. She watched as a mirror was placed before her. At night, she could hear other captives whispering in the dark, the sound of women praying, mourning, or simply breathing to prove they were still alive. One said her husband had burned himself rather than be paraded. Another whispered that her infant had been taken away, to be raised in the Mughal way. The cruelty wasn't just in the blood spilled on battlefields, it was in the quiet erasure of everything that once gave them identity. The next morning, the emperor summoned her. They said he wished to see the Queen of Ashes. The eunuchs dressed her again, gold thread, emeralds, a crown that felt heavier than the defeat itself. When she entered the hall of audience, her eyes met the ruler's, calm, curious, terrifyingly human. "You are proud," he said. "Even in loss." She did not bow. "I am alive," she replied. "But not yours." For a long moment, silence filled the hall. The courtiers watched, breath held, unsure if she had just signed her death. The emperor's face betrayed nothing. He rose, stepped closer, and said softly, "Then live, as the empire's memory of what pride looks like." Devyani was dismissed. Alive, yes. But her freedom had been replaced by a different kind of imprisonment, one of survival, dignity, and silence. In the nights that followed, she learned how to exist within marble walls without letting them swallow her. Outside, poets wrote of Mughal mercy. Inside, the queens learned what mercy meant in the language of conquerors. Weeks passed, but time inside the harem moved differently, like incense smoke twisting without direction. Rani Devyani learned the rules of silence quickly. The women who spoke too much vanished from the courtyards. Those who smiled too easily became stories whispered by servants. The harem was less a home than a labyrinth of obedience, wrapped in silk and fear. Each morning, the call to prayer echoed through the marble halls, blending with the sound of fountains that never ceased. To outsiders, it was paradise, perfumed air, painted ceilings, jeweled lamps that turned dusk into honey. But to those inside, it was a mausoleum of living bodies. The Mughal court called it the Zenana, the palace of women, yet it was a world built to erase their names. Devyani observed everything, how the concubines bowed differently depending on who watched, how the older women pretended peace, and how even laughter sounded rehearsed. The emperor visited rarely, but his presence lingered like incense that never faded. His courtiers spoke of him with reverence, the just one, they said. The merciful. But mercy had many faces. Sometimes it came as a necklace. Sometimes as silence. One evening, Devyani was summoned to a private garden reserved for the emperor's chosen. The path was lined with jasmine, their scent thick under the moonlight. At the center, the emperor sat alone beside a pool of still water, its surface reflecting the stars. "You have not asked for anything," he said without turning. "Not jewels, not land, not favor." "Why?" Devyani's voice was calm. "Because you cannot give me what I want." He looked at her then, studying the defiance that time and fear had failed to break. "And what is that?" "My name," she said. "Not as you call it, not as your poets will write it. The name I had before the gates fell." For the first time, the emperor smiled, not kindly, but like a man who understood tragedy too well. "History forgets what it must," he said. "Even kings." "Then let history forget me," she whispered. The garden fell silent. Crickets sang in the dark. Somewhere far off, a muezzin called the faithful to prayer, his voice rising like a lament. The emperor rose and left without a word. Yet from that night on, she was no longer summoned. Her absence was her gift, and her punishment. Months turned into years. The empire grew. New queens arrived, new wars were fought. The poets sang of conquests and divine justice. And still, behind those walls, the women endured, invisible, graceful, breathing history's silence. Some adapted. Some broke. Devyani neither surrendered nor rebelled. She existed in the in-between, a ghost of her former self. But one night, a new captive arrived, a Rajput girl no older than 16. Frightened, trembling, she clung to Devyani's sari, begging for news of her father. Devyani could not speak the truth, that fathers who fought the Mughals rarely saw dawn again. Instead, she held the girl close and said, "You will live." And living is its own defiance. From then on, whispers spread through the harem of the silent queen who comforts the new ones. Even the eunuchs, once cold, began to show her small kindnesses, an extra lamp, a handful of rose petals for her bath. Power, she realized, did not only come from swords or crowns. It came from endurance, from the refusal to vanish completely. Sometimes, at night, she would stand by the window, watching the faint lights of the city below. Somewhere beyond those walls, people still sang songs of her homeland, songs of courage, of pride, of queens who never bowed. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Let them remember us not as prisoners, but as women who endured." And perhaps, she thought, that was a kind of freedom after all. Years had weathered her into something neither royal nor servile. Rani Devyani no longer wept, nor did she rage. Her silence had become a kind of discipline, the armor she wore when memory threatened to destroy her. The Mughal palace had changed. The emperor who once conquered her world now ruled with age upon his shoulders. His sons fought among themselves. The harem, once orderly, was fractured by ambition. What began as the empire's hidden jewel now festered with intrigue. One night, Devyani was summoned not by the emperor, but by one of his sons, Prince Salim. The eunuch who brought the message trembled as he spoke. "He requests your counsel," he said carefully, though everyone knew what princes often meant when they said such things. Devyani followed anyway, her face unreadable. In the prince's chambers, she found a man haunted by restlessness. He looked nothing like his father, softer, uncertain, a dreamer caught in a cage of gold. "They say you defied my father," he began, his tone part curiosity, part reverence. "They say he called you the Queen of Ashes." Devyani's eyes met his. Names are gifts men give to what they don't understand. He smiled faintly. "Then tell me what I don't understand." She studied him, a young ruler who wanted to be loved by history but didn't know how to deserve it. "You want glory," she said. "But glory without mercy is rot. And mercy without courage is weakness. Your father built an empire. But ask yourself, what did he lose to build it?" The prince fell silent. No one had ever spoken to him like that. For a brief moment, the future of the empire hung in the space between their words. After that night, rumors spread like wildfire, the Rajput queen advising the Mughal prince, a symbol of resistance turned confidant. Some whispered a forbidden affection, others claimed she plotted rebellion through whispers. The harem grew colder toward her. The old women stopped speaking her name aloud. But Devyani had learned long ago that silence was its own weapon. She spoke only when needed, and when she did, her words cut deeper than steel. Empires fall not by enemies, she once told the prince, but by what they silence within. Months passed, and the air in Agra grew heavy with the scent of decay, both literal and moral. The emperor fell ill. The sons prepared for war. Servants vanished. Poets who once praised the court now wrote verses about betrayal. Devyani watched it unfold from behind her lattice window, as if history itself had come to return her gaze. Then one dawn, she saw flames in the distance. The fort of Amer, her homeland, was burning again. News came that her people had rebelled, and the Mughals had answered with fire. Her body trembled, but not from fear. She had long accepted her fate. It was something else, the unbearable truth that the world outside still suffered while she breathed in comfort. That night, she walked barefoot through the harem corridors, her steps soundless against the marble. The younger women stirred in their sleep as she passed. She stopped by the prayer chamber and whispered a vow, not of revenge, but remembrance. "If I am to be forgotten," she said softly, "let me leave a trace in those who survive me." Days later, she began teaching the captives the language of her people, their songs, their faith. In secret, they learned. In secret, they remembered. When the guards discovered her gatherings, she was brought before the dying emperor himself. "You defy my peace," he rasped. She bowed her head. "There is no peace in forgetting." He looked at her for a long time, his face gaunt, his eyes clouded but still sharp. Then, almost like a benediction, he said, "Then remember, and let memory be your punishment." As she was led away, she smiled faintly. For once, the empire had given her what she had always desired, the right to remember, even in chains. Winter came quietly to Agra. The empire that once thundered with armies now groaned beneath its own grandeur. the emperor was dead, and the city mourned him with solemn splendor, drums muffled, banners lowered, the streets flooded with perfumed smoke. Yet inside the harem, the mourning was of another kind, softer, almost hollow. The women who had once trembled before him now moved like shadows freed from a single light. A new ruler had ascended. New orders were given. And among them was one name written in fading ink, Rani Devyani. They said she was too old now to serve the court, too proud to bow to new masters. The decree was simple: she would be transferred to Fatepa Sikri, to live out her remaining years in quiet isolation. When the guards came to escort her, she did not resist. The journey was long, through red sandstone roads and dust-covered plains that once belonged to her people. In the stillness of the carriage, she remembered the girl she had been, riding through Muir's golden fields, her anklets chiming against the stirrup. She remembered her husband's last words before the siege: if the gates fall, burn what they touch. And she had, once. But the fire had never truly gone out, it had lived within her all these years, unseen, steady, patient. When she arrived at the palace of Sikri, the halls were half empty, the air thick with dust. The empire had shifted its capital to Lahore, and this place, once built as a monument to divine vision, was now a monument to forgetting. Devyani's quarters overlooked a silent courtyard where pigeons cooed on cracked domes. She would sit by the window, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the sill, whispering old hymns that no one remembered. One afternoon, a messenger arrived, a young scribe, trembling as he bowed. "The prince, now emperor, sends word," he said. "He asks if you regret defying his father." Devyani smiled, a quiet, knowing curve of lips that spoke of lifetimes. "Tell him I regret nothing that required courage," she said. "And nothing that required mercy." The boy hesitated. He also said, "He still remembers your words." "Then history is not lost yet," she murmured. After he left, she opened a small chest she had carried from Agra. Inside were fragments of her past, a broken bangle, a strip of her old wedding sari, a page from a book written in her native script. She had hidden them for decades, keeping pieces of herself safe from the empire that sought to erase her. That night, she lit a lamp beside the chest, watching the flame flicker against the glass. Outside, the wind carried faint sounds of a procession, the new emperor's soldiers, perhaps, or travelers moving toward the capital. But to her, it sounded like a chant, a remembrance of all the voices swallowed by time. She began to write. Slowly, carefully, she penned the stories of the women who had lived and died within those marble walls, the names of the forgotten, the queens who had refused to disappear. When dawn came, she sealed the parchment and placed it beneath the stone floor of her chamber. "Let them find us one day," she whispered. "Let them know we lived." Years later, when Fatepa Sikri fell silent once more, when the last attendants left, when the birds took nests in the domes, her name vanished from records. Yet the legend endured. Local villagers spoke of a queen whose spirit wandered the corridors, guarding the secrets of the harem. They called her the Bride of Ashes, the woman who defied kings by surviving them all. And sometimes, when the wind passes through the broken arches of the old palace, it carries a faint echo, not of sorrow, but of strength. A whisper in an ancient tongue saying, "Mercy is fleeting. Memory endures." The empire forgot her, but history, in its quiet way, remembered.